Hello and welcome to Eternal Beasts, where the imperfect dead are salvaged and given new life. I've been incorporating taxidermied roadkill into my sculptures for many years. On this channel, I'll share some tips for working with animals killed by traffic or natural causes. These can present some unique challenges for the taxidermist, but being readily available, they're also a good source if you're just starting out in taxidermy. This video shows my own views, opinions, and processes. It's not necessarily the right way to do things, but nor is it the wrong way. It's my way. I respect the animals that I work with, and I really don't want this video to seem exploitive, so I've used a blue filter throughout to make it less gory. First up, you're going to need some basic tools. Yes, you can use an X-Acto blade or craft knife. However, I'd recommend getting some disposable scalpels. They're readily available online or at pharmacies. I use a number 4 metal handle with replaceable number 22 blades. I find the curved blade of the number 22 is easier to control than a straight pointed one, and I'm also less likely to poke holes in the pelt. For health and safety, I recommend wearing 2 pairs of disposable gloves. Therefore, if one gets a hole in it, your hands are still protected. Thirdly, an old towel will absorb any bodily fluids and help protect your work surface. You could also throw it in the laundry afterwards and reuse it. You're likely to need something to cut through bone. Kitchen scissors or pliers will work. I use a pair of salvage bone cutters I found at a medical auction, but you don't have to be that fancy. And of course, you'll need a salvaged small mammal. I'll do a separate video on collecting and storing specimens, but for today's purposes, I'm working with a roadkill feral Australian rabbit that's been frozen and thawed. There's a couple of other tools that you might find useful. Some paper towels. When is a paper towel not useful? There's going to be a special feature of one later in this video. Now, borax is often used as a dry preservative on really small animals instead of tanning them, but I use it to apply to any leaks or blood on the animal's fur, as it really helps get stains out when the pelt is washed later. Also handy, but not essential, is a pair of long tweezers. These make turning long legs easier. I got mine at the same medical equipment auction that I found my bone cutters, but again, they're not necessary. Once you've gathered up your tools and you've got your work surface set up, it's time to get to know your animal. I like to do this because I can check over the outside of the entire animal before I actually start any sort of skinning. I'm making sure any spots of blood have a good pinch of borax applied to them. I'm also checking to see if there's any obvious damage to the external skin. As this rabbit was frozen, I'm carefully moving all his legs to free up the muscles and joints. And by feeling around his body, I can get a sense of where he might have internal injuries, including any broken bones that may damage his skin further. When working with roadkill, my preference is always to do a dorsal incision, that's to cut along the spine instead of along the belly. The likelihood of him having trauma to his abdomen is pretty high, and I want to minimize the chance of getting bodily fluids on his fur, or on me. I found another spot of blood here, so I'm just applying a little bit more borax. Oh, and that is the scalpel I prefer. Note the size and curve of a number 22 blade. Like I said, it's just my preference, but I find them a lot easier to manage. So before I start the incision, I'm going to give him a very attractive center part. The downside of a dorsal incision is that it's quite visible. So parting the fur means that I'm not going to be cutting chunks of the fur out when I'm doing my incision. And the line of stitches will be less obvious when he's mounted. My initial incision strokes are really light, as I don't want to cut through the fascia through to the flesh. The aim here is to separate the skin from the animal by cutting just the fascia, not through the flesh. It's kind of like taking off its little t-shirt, only really, really, really slowly. My incision line starts at about the base of the rabbit's neck, goes straight along the spine until approximately 5 centimeters or 2 inches from the tail. This gives me heaps of room to cleanly remove the pelt in one piece. By gently pulling the fur, I've now exposed the fascia. I can lift up the pelt using the rabbit's body weight only, which clearly shows that silvery white membrane. It's this membrane that I'm cutting, so not the skin and not the flesh, but just this translucent curtain between the two. Even though I'm using a roadkill rabbit, these techniques described can apply to most small mammals. Here in Australia, rabbits are an introduced environmental pest and not subject to any wildlife laws. Before you go picking up any old dead animal on the side of the road, make sure you're familiar with your local wildlife laws about what you can and can't use. Just because they're already dead doesn't necessarily mean you can just help yourself. So I'm continuing to cut through the fascia, lifting the pelt high enough that the rabbit's weight will show this stretched out membrane. And when I said I could feel fractured ribs, here you can see some of the trauma to the chest and bruising on his skin. Getting as far down the right-hand side of his body as I can, but stopping before I get too close to his belly. When I've gone as far as I can, I turn him around and skin down the other side. Again, I'm lifting up his pelt using his body weight to expose and stretch the fascia and carefully cutting through just that white membrane to separate the pelt. Gosh, look at that bruising. This little guy must have gone underneath the car's wheels. Where bruising is really heavy, sometimes internal bleeding will make the fascia adhere to the skin and you'll have to just scrape the skin away, but that's not happening here. I can still just separate it. Now I'm going to skin out his left rear leg. I'm skinning down his outer thigh until I get to his knee. There's his knee through the fur. Pushing on his heel with my left hand, I can push his knee up and out through the pelt. You can see the white knee joint right there. Using that same gentle slicing motion, I carefully cut through the fascia all around the upper part of his leg, just to above the hind foot. But be really careful here not to cut through the pelt around the leg and not to cut yourself. Oh, and be really careful not to pierce the abdomen with your scalpel. This is where I find that curved blades make life much easier. I'm really keeping the pelt pulled quite tightly with my left hand while also pushing his knee up from his foot. His hind leg is actually really badly broken, which makes this a bit more challenging to hold firmly, and his foot keeps moving around in my hand. But eventually I skin far enough down his shin so that I can find the gap in behind his knee. It's actually easier just to push a finger through that little bit of membrane than to try and cut it with a blade. Once I've opened up that little gap, I can change my grip and continue to skin down his lower leg through to his ankle. When I'm right at the bottom of his ankle, like just above his heel bone, I sever the Achilles tendon, grab my bone cutters, and cut through his leg just above the ankle, separating his foot from his body. I then roll him over and repeat the same process down his right hind leg. Without this sounding too weird, I can really appreciate this little rabbit. He is in his prime. He's highly muscled, he's lean, he's got a beautiful thick pelt. Any female bunny would be very happy to meet this little guy. Now, I don't always cut the leg bones like this to separate the feet. I do also leave the feet on and skin them whole with the leg. I use that technique mostly when I want to be able to reuse the entire skeleton for articulation. But with this little rabbit, I could tell that he had a lot of bone fractures, and therefore I'm not going to be able to use his whole skeleton, maybe a few bones. I also wasn't sure how much damage there was going to be to his internal organs. So it's actually much quicker to cut the leg bones and skin the feet later, which means that there's less time for any abdominal contents to potentially leak out. So I've finished skinning out the hind legs and I've separated his hind feet from his body. So they're still attached to the pelt, but they're full of bones. I'll skin out his feet after I've skinned out the rest of his body. I stop skinning his back just at the base of his tail. I don't need to split his tail, as once I've removed the bones, the tan will still penetrate and there's not a lot of spare flesh on rabbit tails. I plan to have a future video which shows how to split out a longer tail as well. But for now, I'm going to cut through the tailbone and then skin over the genital area and his belly. Again, this is roadkill, so I have no idea what to expect. His abdomen feels fairly firm, so I'm hoping it won't be really messy. With taxidermy, the idea is that you want the least exposure to body fluids so that the pelt is kept clean. Remember, we're taking off a t-shirt, we're not gutting an animal. Again, I'm holding the pelt in my left hand and applying fairly firm pressure to pull and stretch out that membrane. I want to retain as much, if not all, of the pelt in the genital area. This is a healthy young male with very healthy musk glands, and once you've smelt them, you will never forget it. The structures you see are the tailbone, the colon, and the testes. If there's poop, this is where you're going to come across it. I cut through the vertebrae of his tail. As I said, I'll remove the remaining tailbones later. Cutting through the tail makes removing the skin around the anus and genitals much easier. It's also easier to identify the urethra and cut through this. Now, I am really pleased to see that his abdominal cavity hasn't been punctured. Belly skin also contains much more subcutaneous fat than an animal's back. So I'm trying to leave as much of this on the body, just because it means there's going to be less for me to shave off later. As I'm coming up his body and to his rib cage, the amount of trauma, bruising, hemorrhaging is becoming way more obvious. That bruising isn't confined to his back, but it's all across the underside of his chest. You can actually see a hemopneumothorax with blood and air bubbles seen coming out here in his chest. Normally this area should be pink and smooth. This substantial bruising has also adhered to his skin, meaning that I am having to carefully scrape the tissue off the skin. So this little guy probably died instantly, but many don't. And it's knowing how much trauma these little bodies can sustain without death. Now that I'm up to his shoulder, I can start skinning out his front legs. This is much the same as how you do the hind legs. Sometimes it can be tricky to get elbows exposed, so keep feeling around his anatomy with your non-scalpel wielding hand as you're going. These hematomas are just awful. I don't want this video just to be a gross out, but I also do want to demonstrate how I skin out front limbs. I'll keep filming while we're just seeing bruising, given that his rib cage still appears to be in one piece and his front limb isn't broken. So as for the hind legs, skin right down the upper arm to the elbow and find that little space on the inner elbow. You can cut or push your finger through that membrane. You can see I'm actually applying quite a bit of tension, pulling the pelt down towards and over his front foot. Like I did in the rear, I'm going to skin down to his wrist, and then I'm going to cut the bone before repeating on the other side. Except when I started on his right front leg, it was immediately obvious that his injuries are severe. So out of respect for this little guy, I've edited out skinning his other front leg. I picked up the video with a paper towel covering the worst part of the damage, and I'm starting to film the final stage of skinning out his body, which is to complete the neck and head. However, when I started doing that, there's a lot of gore, there's bone fragments everywhere, and honestly, this is not what this channel is meant to be about. I'll definitely have a future video showing just the neck and head skinning process, but on a different animal. But this time, I reckon Mr. Bunny has suffered enough. So while he was internally battered and broken, his pelt is still beautiful and still usable. And so that you can see he was indeed salvageable, here he is. He's still very wet from having a bath, but he's no longer stained by blood. I took his broken little body into the forest that surrounds my home, where he provided a meal for the resident native quolls. In death, he can support life. I welcome all comments and questions, and I'll definitely try to respond to as many as I can. Please also leave any suggestions for other videos that you'd like to see me make. I'd also appreciate any suggestions on how you think I could make these videos better.